Hey, everyone. Okay, there we go. Hi, everyone. I really appreciate you all coming. So today we're going to talk about something that strikes fear into all of our hearts, which is interviewing. But before we do, let me introduce myself. My name's Alex Karp. I'm an app engineering manager at Wayfair. For those of you who have yet to be flooded by our television ads, we're an e-commerce company focusing on home goods and furniture. Now, after 12 years of resistance, I've finally created a Twitter account, so feel free to friend me, follow me, stalk me, whatever it is you do on Twitter. I'm still learning the lingo a little bit. But I should probably warn you that at this point, I've only had it for about a week, so it's kind of like if your grandfather had a Twitter. But I'm learning. You can also feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if you'd like. So now, show of hands. How many of us get nervous walking into an interview? Should be all of us. Mark Twain once said, there are two types of speakers, those who get nervous and those who are liars. I believe that interview candidates are the exact same way. And why shouldn't you be? You're probably interviewing for this really awesome job at this really great company. You've fantasized about spending all that extra money that they're going to pay you. But that interviewer is out to get you. They're watching. They're trying to find your every flaw. And really, getting rejected by this company would say a lot about your perceived value as a human being. Pretty soon, all of your friends will stop inviting you out to the pub, and you'll live the rest of your life a social recluse. I'm not helping, am I? Let's take a step back then. Interviewing makes everybody nervous, but I believe that it's how we handle our nerves that makes the difference, and could make the difference between the "we're so happy to make you an offer" phone call and the "please try again next year" email. So today I want to talk about the different things that we can do to give ourselves the absolute best possible fighting chance in an interview. So let's look at the agenda. Make audience nervous. Well, I think I did that one. Next, we're going to talk about a couple of common mishaps that I've seen. Then I want to get into some strategies for during the interview. I want to talk about how to practice all of this. And finally, I want to help you walk into your next interview with confidence. But before I get into mishaps, I just want to point out quickly that the information that I'm going to talk about today is applicable to most technical interviews, whether they're app-based, system-based, even algorithms-based, whether they're on the keyboard or on the whiteboard. In fact, I'll get back to that later. So, in the mishaps section, I wanted to highlight a couple of things that I see happening often during interviews. So one of these things is not being able to commit to a choice. And this happens regardless of what type of interview it is. It's this idea that I could do it this way or that way. Which would you prefer? And to be perfectly blunt, what I'd prefer is for them to be able to make that choice on their own. Because usually we're talking about two perfectly valid options, like MVC versus MVVM, or recursion versus iteration. It's great that they're able to identify these options, but to me, the real skill is to be able to say, these are my options, this is the one that I'm going to go with, and this is why. It's being able to make those sorts of informed decisions is a great skill, and this is your chance to show that. Another thing that I see more often than you might think, though maybe not if you saw Paul's talk yesterday, is copying and pasting code. This is really only an issue when we ask the candidate to do something on the computer and we give them access to the internet. And so while I prefer that people don't copy and paste code, I don't stop people from doing it. And what usually happens is they'll go onto Stack Overflow or Ray Wenderlich or wherever they get their code from, and they'll copy something without reading it or understanding it. And so a few minutes later, when things aren't working, they have no idea it's because the code that they copied didn't do exactly what they wanted it to. You wouldn't sign a contract without reading it first, right? Okay, maybe that's not the best example, but you get the point. If you're going to copy code from the internet, make sure that you understand what it does. Otherwise, you could end up in a lot of trouble. The second thing that I wanted to talk about were strategies for during the interview. I find that particularly when I'm nervous, having a set of steps is really helpful. Because when you have a set of steps, you always know what's coming next. And it also means that I'm much less likely to forget things that are important. So here are my 10 steps for making it through a technical interview in one piece. Number 1, ask questions. Interview questions are often deliberately vague. They do this to simulate real-life situations. Think about it. In your day-to-day job, it's very likely that you'll get asked to do something without having all of the facts first. This could be that new feature that's missing design mocks, or that big feature that's a little bit short on specifics. In these situations, we're expected to be able to figure out what it is we need to know and ask questions to get that information. This is just like that. Number 2, we need to try out a sample input or a normal user flow. For an algorithm, this might be starting out with the most basic input and figuring out what that output should be. Then try another one. And then see if you can come up with a process that works for both of them. Then try a third input. If this sounds familiar, you've probably done test-driven development before. Number 3, think about possible edge cases. So for an algorithm, this might be, what sorts of inputs are invalid? What sorts of inputs produce non-standard results? For a feature, this might be, what happens if the user taps somewhere unexpected? What happens if the user inputs letters for their phone number? What happens if the server returns back invalid data? Notice how at this point, we still haven't written a single line of code or fleshed out a single piece of the system. I think that not immediately jumping to writing code makes people nervous. And that makes sense, because we're being judged on our ability to write the code that solves the problem. And so naturally, we focus on that code, how much we're writing, how quickly we're writing it, and whether we're going to finish. So spending time on all of this doesn't feel like it makes sense, because it's just taking away from the time that we could be writing code. But here's a secret. Coming up with a good plan is the key to success. You don't necessarily have to plan out everything in advance, but having an idea of what you want to do ahead of time will save you time in the long run. In general, the decisions that you make at this point will help prevent you from making mistakes in the future. Because the worst thing that can happen is that you go down a path, you get halfway through, and then you realize it won't work and you have to start over. Planning things out in advance allows you to move faster later on. Number 4, we need to think out loud. And not just at this stage, at every stage. Thinking out loud is hard to do effectively, but it gives your interviewer insight into how you think and how you go about solving problems. That's really important. And so to demonstrate that, let's pretend like I'm being interviewed for some position that involves me doing a lot of math without a calculator. And so the question that I'm asked is, what is 15 times 12? And so upon being asked that, I think about the answer for several seconds. Trust me, that's the most awkward part of the talk. So I come up with the answer, 180. Now, let's think about what we learned from my performance, aside from the fact that I can't act worth a damn. You could say that I got the answer right, but can you definitively say that given two numbers like 15 and 12, I'll be able to replicate that process? Not really, right? Because while it's possible that while I was standing and looking at that problem, I was doing the math, it's also possible that I just knew the answer off the top of my head. It's even possible that I just guessed and got incredibly lucky. Now, what if I'd said 165 instead of 180? Here, not only do we still not know if I know how to do multiplication, I didn't even get the answer right. So at this point, you know, my future at unnamed awesome corporation isn't looking so bright. But what if we take a step back, and instead of just staring at the problem and making everybody uncomfortable, I think out loud, or I write it down. And so I know that 15 times 2 is 30, and that 15 times 10 is 150. And if I add those two together, that's 180. Here, I still got the right answer. But you can all be a lot more confident that given two numbers like 15 and 12, I'll be able to replicate this process and get to the right answer. And In the case where I made a mistake, it becomes a lot clearer where I made that mistake. What I actually find most interesting about this case is that it's still pretty clear that I understand the process of multiplication. I just made a small mistake within that. And really, that would get me a lot in the way of partial credit. And we'll get back to that later. So number 5, we need to break problems down. All too often, when given a task during an interview, we try to do it all in one big chunk. And what sometimes happens is we get to the end of the interview, we're 95% of the way there, and all we have to show for it is a bunch of code that we wrote. This feels awful. It's kind of like if we had this 2-week sprint, and we worked on this really large story in those 2 weeks. And at the end of those 2 weeks, we have nothing we can commit, nothing we can show for it. You wouldn't do that in real life, would you? You'd break things down into smaller tasks and work on them one by one. Your interview should be the exact same way. By breaking things down and working on them one by one, you create concrete milestones for yourself to complete. Number 6, we need to prioritize. Now that we've broken things down, we should identify which of them should be done first. Which things represent the absolute bare bones versus which things are more superfluous? Which pieces depend on one another? And we should be making sure that we work on the most integral parts first. Guess what? We're finally ready to write code. I know that it probably feels like these first 6 steps will take too long during your interview, but they really will save you time, because now you have a game plan. Really, those first 6 steps should only take you a couple of minutes, and I'll show you later how to make sure that's the case. Number 7, back to the list. Don't try anything fancy or new, at least by default. That hot new architecture you just read about, the exciting features in the latest version of your programming language that just came out, don't use them. You might think, now's my chance to impress my interviewer by trying something new. Don't do it. It's too much risk. You risk getting lost and having to start over, or even not being able to finish at all. Your interviewer is much more interested in whether you can get something accomplished than whether you're able to use the latest robust cloud synergies. Number 8, we need to get something done. Developers are often told that we should be committing code as frequently as possible. So why not try to apply that same principle to our interview? Start by working on the pieces you've identified, one by one, and keep it simple. As you complete them, quickly test them to make sure that they're working. I'm not saying that you have to write a full-on unit test suite, but you should be able to show somehow that they're working. Number 9, reevaluate. No matter how carefully we plan, it's always possible that we run into something we don't expect. Maybe there was one piece that you didn't realize was dependent on another. Or maybe the requirements changed a bit halfway through. It happens. Sometimes it happens on purpose. In these situations, we need to be able to look at the plan we've come up with and reevaluate with new information. Is everything still prioritized correctly? Do I have all the pieces that I need? And number 10, everything else. So assuming we've gotten to this point, we've gotten something complete. Even if it's just a basic implementation, we have something working. That's huge. So at this point, we should give ourselves a pat on the back, because not everybody gets this far. And now that we've got a tiny bit of weight lifted off of our shoulders, that allows us to focus on the nice-to-haves. In no particular order, these are things like, how efficient is my code? Do I need unit tests? How do I handle errors gracefully? I feel like that was a lot of information. So how do we actually use this information to get better at interviewing? Interviewing is a skill, and just like any other skill, we need to practice. It doesn't matter whether you're interviewing for your first job or you're a seasoned pro looking for your next. Everyone needs to practice. Since we're not just constantly interviewing, we get rusty. And when we get rusty, we don't do as well. one of the things that we should be doing is working on technical interviewing problems. Try doing maybe one a week, even if you're not actively looking, just to keep your skills sharp. And if you are looking, try closer to one a day. I promise you, the more of these you do, the more comfortable you'll feel. But just make sure that you're practicing, that you're focusing on the right things as you're practicing. Oftentimes, I feel like by practicing these problems, we're trying to create this bank of problems that we can draw on during the interview. Like we're hoping that we'll only get asked these problems. But if we think of the sheer number of questions that can be asked during a technical interview, represented by this orange circle, and then we think about the number of questions that we've studied, represented by the blue, that's not a lot. Even if we assume that we automatically get any question that we've studied correct, that's still not great odds. Now, at this point, you might be saying, but Alex, studying one question doesn't necessarily mean that I can only get that one question right. I can apply the concepts from that one question and solve many other questions. And I would say, sure, that's true. And I'd even be very generous and say for each problem that is similar to a problem that you've studied, you also have a 100% chance of getting it right. And then that looks like this. And you might say, but that's a 45% chance. That's pretty good. And I would say, well, what if I told you for that other 55%, the problems that you don't know and that aren't similar to anything you've seen before, you have a 100% chance of getting them wrong. That changes things a bit, doesn't it? It's kind of like if I told you that if you walked outside today, that there's a 55% chance that you'd get hit by a bus. Not this bus, a real 3-dimensional bus that would hurt. Would that 45% chance still look as good to you? And you might say, but Alex, I can't possibly know these numbers for a fact. You're just making them up. And I'd say, yes. Yes, I am. But I'm proving a point. Because it doesn't matter if it's 55%, 25%, or even 10%. Would you go outside? Maybe. But I bet you'd be pretty nervous if you did. Oops. There we go. Interviewing is the same way. If we only focus on the problems themselves, then we aren't being mindful of the skills that we use to solve these problems. So we become very good at solving specific problems and not solving problems in general. By thinking specifically about how you go about solving problems, regardless of whether you do them the way that I showed you or your own way, you're building your own box of tools that you can use. These tools might not be enough to be able to help you solve every problem you don't know, but they'll certainly help you get a lot in the way of partial credit. And they'll definitely make you feel a little bit more confident during your next interview. Another way that you should be practicing is with a friend or colleague. Once you feel comfortable solving these problems on your own, it's important to start working on how well you communicate how you solve these problems. As such, have them focus on how well you think out loud. They should be able to tell you exactly how you got from the beginning to the end, what decisions you made, and why you made them. Have them focus on how well you're breaking problems down. Are you still trying to do everything at once, or are you breaking things down into the smallest logical pieces? And are the pieces that you're breaking things down into making sense? And how well are you focusing on getting something done? In our sprint analogy, are you committing frequently? Are you iterating instead of trying to get everything done at once? Doing this with another person will give you valuable feedback and will help you practice these skills. But remember, with both of these ways of practicing, don't try practicing everything I talked about at once. That's honestly just a recipe for a panic attack. Try practicing just one or two things at a time. Once you get comfortable with those things, try one or two more. And as you're practicing, try using a mixture of mediums. Try using a mixture of writing code out by hand and writing it out on the computer, because you never know what you'll be asked to do, so it's best to be comfortable with both. I also wanted to lightly tackle the question of what sorts of problems should I be working on, and what sorts of things should I be studying? I say lightly because I don't think it's really useful for me to stand up here and list out data structures and algorithms and architectures and frameworks. There are books for that. In fact, these are some of them. What I'm going to do instead is recommend that as you practice these problems, take note of the concepts that they use. and take note of the things that other people use to solve them. With each problem, try to learn one new thing. Because with each piece of information you learn, that gives you more options. That gives you more options when it comes to solving problems. To summarize the section, try working on problems alone, being mindful of the process used to solve them. Then try working on these problems in front of somebody else, working hard to explain these processes, your thought processes as you go. And the entire time, look for little pieces of information you can learn from each problem. Finally, I wanted to talk about confidence, because I think it's an area where all of us could use some help. It's really easy to convince yourself things like, I'm not good at interviewing. I'm not going to get that job anyway. They're looking for somebody with more experience. It's going to be too hard. I'm going to make a mistake, and I shouldn't have even applied. I know, because these are the sorts of things that go through my head right before an interview. And I know that makes it a lot harder to succeed. It's like if you're trying to build a shelter, and right before you start building that shelter, it starts to rain, or it starts to snow. You might be very good at building that shelter, but if the weather gets bad, then all bets are off. In order to give ourselves the best chance possible, we need to have confidence in ourselves. And I know that's easier said than done, much easier. So let's see if I can't share a few facts with you from the interviewer's perspective that might help. I'm going to start with the one that's probably the hardest to believe. Your interviewer is actually hoping you'll succeed. Think about it. If they're looking to hire somebody, that means that they need more people. And the quicker they find these people, the less time they have to spend interviewing. They're actually hoping it's going to be you. They wouldn't be talking to you otherwise. Number 2, everyone starts out with a clean slate. And what you do with that slate is up to you. Number 3, you don't need to be perfect in your interview. If you did, most of us wouldn't have jobs, myself included. Interviews test a bunch of different skills. Each job requires a different combination of those skills. As long as you do well in the things that you're good at and well enough in the things that you're not, that's really all you can ask for. Number 4, practice helps with your confidence. The more you practice, the more comfortable you'll feel answering these questions. Number 5, things won't go perfectly. They just won't. And honestly, expecting that they will only makes you more nervous when they don't. Number 6, whether you're accepted or rejected, it says absolutely nothing about you, who you are, and your value. And finally, number 7, I believe that true confidence in an interview comes from knowing how to approach problems that you don't know the answer to. And if you've been practicing, then you already know how to do that. So you need to believe in yourself. When you get nervous about interviewing, try remembering these things. Hopefully they help. Other things you can do include breathing exercises, like breathing in for 4 seconds and breathing out for 7. Or even power poses. They sound kind of silly and look a bit silly too, but I'll be damned if they don't help. And these are all just ways of helping yourself fake it until you can make it. Time to recap. First, we talked about common mishaps during interviews. We learned that we need to be able to make informed decisions and be wary of copying code. Second, we talked about my 10 steps for during the interview. We talked about asking questions, trying out sample input, thinking about edge cases, thinking out loud, breaking the problem down, prioritizing, not trying anything new, getting something done, reevaluating, and then everything else. Third, we talked about how to practice. We talked about working on problems on our own to develop our own set of steps for solving problems, even if it's not the one that I outlined. We talked about studying as we go, trying not to study everything at once that we think we might need. And then we talked about, once we're comfortable with working problems on our own, having a friend help us evaluate how well we think out loud, break problems down, and get something done. And finally, we talked about confidence. We talked about the different things that your interviewer actually wants you to know. Like, they want you to succeed. Everyone starts out with a blank slate. You don't need to be perfect during your interview. Practice helps with confidence. That things won't go perfectly. They just won't, and that's okay. That your interview has absolutely no bearing on who you are and what value you bring. And that true confidence in an interview comes from knowing how to deal with the problems that you don't know the answer to. Interviews can be stressful, but with proper preparation, they can go really well. And I promise you that if you try out some of these things, you'll walk into your next interview with more confidence, and you will really knock their socks off. And while I'm on the subject, Wayfair is looking to hire a truly ridiculous number of iOS and Android developers this year. We're predominantly looking for at our headquarters in Boston in the US. We'll also be looking for some for our Berlin office in the next few months. So feel free to chat with me about it or check our careers website. Thanks again for your time.